ingenuity, hard work, strong. The people of East Tennessee are connected to the land. They have fought, loved, lived, and tilled the soil. Everyone who calls this home is part of that history. And that history is told on East Tennessee PBS. Become a member of East Tennessee PBS today.
East Tennessee Voices, African American Women and Political History was made possible through the financial support of the East Tennessee Foundation and through a partnership with Chick History, the Beck Cultural Exchange Center, and by viewers like you. Thank you.
On August 26, 1920, the 19th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified, declaring that voting could no longer be denied by sex. It was a major victory in the battle for women's suffrage in America. A month prior, from July 12th through the 16th, the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs convened at Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. Top of mind for the congregation was the impending passage of the 19th Amendment. A committee issued resolutions to be disseminated, which outlined the hopes and concerns of African American women, soon to be invested with the right of full franchise. They encouraged women to learn and become familiar with the political process and current issues. They advocated for equal access to education and the building of libraries and schools. They urged that school curriculum include the contributions of African Americans to history and society. Above all, they outlined the great racial and social issues of the time and their desire to bring about justice. Women leaders in schools, clubs, and churches heeded the call and advocated and worked for the causes of education, healthcare, and racial equality. For African American women, the passage of the 19th Amendment presented an opportunity to make change and uplift their communities and country. On occasion of the centennial commemoration of the 19th Amendment, East Tennessee PBS, in partnership with the Beck Cultural Exchange Center and Chick History, hosted a conversation with some of Knoxville's Black women leaders in which they shared memories and reflections of African American women's political history. Hi, my name is Reverend Renee Kesler, president of the Beck Culture Exchange Center. Beck is the place where African American history and culture are preserved. I am just so delighted that I get the privilege of having a conversation with today African American women, great in their own rights. I'd like to start by first introducing to my right, Mae Robinson. Welcome. I am just so delighted that sitting right next to her, Cynthia Finch. Welcome. Thank you. And to your right, I am awesomely excited to introduce Olga Welch. And sitting next to her, my privilege, Sylvia Peters. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Everyone sitting around this semicircle, truly educated women. And how can we not start the conversation talking about education? Because education has played such a pivotal role in our lives and indeed the history of African American and specifically African American women. Why was education so important to you? Why, Miss Mae, is education so important?
Education literally opens the door to the future. Mm-hmm. I didn't ask my husband Johnny, do you think I could go back to Knoxville College with Mrs. Howell and finish Knoxville College? My husband didn't say, well, I don't think so. We have 4 children here. That was the reason for it. So I just told him one day that, Johnny, I'm going to go back to school this fall.
Yes.
And guess what? I took that bus, the bus stopped right across the street from us. I took that bus for 2 years. But the bottom line is, I finished.
Listening to your story about education and coming from a little small town in Newport, Tennessee, with 9 children, 5 brothers, and 3 sisters, and I realized how important it was for me to go to college, and my mom was so very, very proud when I came from small Newport, Tennessee, in that black Ford truck, and my dad dropped me off at the University of Tennessee. That was a happy moment.
I came from 5 generations of college-educated women, all right, from slavery on. And so the motto of the family was, to those to whom much is given, much is expected. So my family built businesses, my grandparents built 2 churches and businesses, but here's the interesting thing that ties my story to yours and makes the ancestor piece so important to me, is that my grandfather and my grandmother used that money to educate their own children.
I went to an all-girls college in Evanston, Illinois, and it was a struggle. It really was a struggle. I am the most distinguished member of my class from that girls' school in 1959. I've had experiences that I wouldn't have dreamed of, but it was because I learned to be tenacious and to stick to it and to not be beaten down by the fact that I was the only African American and very poor, very poor. My parents did not have the money for that kind of situation, but I made it anyway.
We, the black students, knew that there were 2 areas that were cut off from us. One was to become the Dogwood Queen, and the second was to become the valedictorian of the class. We collectively, as the African American students, decided to identify the smartest one among us in all the subjects, and we identified her. And then we all pooled our collective knowledge, and we were not African American females only. We pooled our knowledge and we tutored her. We tutored her in the restroom. We tutored her under the bleachers because we decided as a class that she was going to be the first African American valedictorian in the history of that school. We tutored her, we prepared her, and she passed all of the exams, beat all of the ambassador's children, and became the valedictorian. And when she walked across the stage and people were saying, how did this happen? How could this possibly have occurred? All of us smiled and said, this represents who we've always been.
Knoxville becomes a city in 1791. It'll be 1969 before the first African American woman will hold office in Knoxville, Miss Sarah Moore Green. She will become the school board, a member of the City of Knoxville School Board at that time.
I'm so happy that you mentioned her name too, because she was a pioneer. She was the reason why we have universal kindergarten in the entire state of Tennessee.
That's exactly right.
For her work.
She was a strong, staunch advocate for early childhood education.
Remember that the slaves built schools and colleges the moment they were emancipated. That was the way they did it. So I think your point about nurturing, your point about pushing and the expectation that we were all going to go to college, it permeates our culture.
I'm curious if you remember seeing clubs of women, right? So there were always these community clubs. Maybe they called them social clubs. Maybe they called them women's clubs, things like that. Because really, that becomes the basis for a political campground, if you will. Do you remember any of the women's clubs?
I remember my mother, the women would have these meetings. I thought they were meetings, but they were card playing, and they would dress up. Yeah. Oh, they would have the heels and they would dress, and they would have their dresses on and their heels and their hats, and they would go from home to home every weekend. These little clubs, these little gatherings were also forums, opportunity to dialogue, and opportunities to plan how they were going to elevate their families.
Social clubs were vehicles through which they organized in order to promote voting, to promote open access.
Yes.
They believed that they needed to present an appropriate picture.
Yes.
And if they could get coverage from the then Negro press, and occasionally from white presses, when they came into these organizational spaces, sororities, missionary units, private entertainment clubs, if you will, what they found were women who were organizing.
So we're talking about this whole idea of the suffrage movement and women and their involvement.
I must say that I was raised as a Lincoln Republican, like many African Americans.
Absolutely.
People don't realize that about us. And so I voted for a Republican, Nixon, who was a dear friend of our family. And I have pictures at home of Aunt Ethel with President Nixon.
Wow, very proud. Do you remember?
I think that, like you, I think I was 21. My grandmother on my father's side actually was a spokesperson for the Republican Party across Ohio. She organized African Americans for the Republicans. And I think that, as you said, they were Lincoln Republicans.
Right.
So they identified with the emancipation. So our ancestors they were very politically savvy.
Yes.
What they did was to align themselves with the party that would most promote equality
Absolutely.
for African Americans. So you voted because you wanted as much access to equality as you possibly could get. And I think that's an important part to make. African Americans are not voting tribally. We don't do that.
Right.
We vote because we are still in search of equality.
Right.
I remember my father saying to all of us, I don't care if it's an election for dog catcher. You will be at the polls because, and this is a point he made over and over, there is blood on those ballots.
Oh, yes. I went to the polls with my grandmother when I was 2.5 years old. Wow. That's my first memory. My grandmother worked at the polls. We were asked to pass out literature for different presidential and different offices.
Right there, because this is history. So tell me your grandmother's name.
Her name was Bessie Austin Payne. And
so she was politically involved even, and what year are we talking about?
My grandmother was born in the 1870s, 1880s. Wow. And her family came up from South Carolina through Kentucky, through Tennessee to Indiana, and they had a laundry there. They had a business, a laundry. Wow. And she graduated from a normal teacher's college. So her business always was that her children were going to be educated.
But I want to share a quick story about a woman whose name is never mentioned. It simply says a colored woman. This is what the paper says. And it says that this day was the first day that women went to the polls in Knoxville, Tennessee to vote. And everything went fairly well. It was fairly uneventful, except for this one poll. It looked like traffic had gotten backed up for a little while. It looked like there was a little confusion there, but it got worked out. But apparently the confusion was over the fact that a colored woman had walked into the polls to vote with her daughter, and she wanted her daughter to cast her ballot. Wow. And when the poll worker asked her, "Your daughter cannot cast your ballot, you must." And she said, well, she couldn't see. And after determining that if you could see to walk into the polls, then you could see to cast your own ballot. So if you can't read, then you can't cast your ballot. The paper goes on to say that they made a few phone calls to figure out what needed to happen. And they said, well, no, her daughter can't cast her ballot. They decided the poll worker could cast her ballot for her. So when we think about the school system, for example, any of you remember having Black history taught in the school system, and what's the earliest age do you recall that being a part of the program?
Early in my college life, I met Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
Yes.
And I was the only African American at my school, and there were a few others at Northwestern, and he suggested that after we finished our work, we should return home and try to do things to our communities. He was a remarkable human being, to say the least. So I did, and somehow or other, I was a kindergarten teacher and found myself teaching Black history on closed circuit television to a whole range of schools in my district. And I was judged by Black and white people. It was ridiculous. I did a whole series on Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and they would not present it because he was too controversial at that time. This was back in the 60s. And it wasn't until 1969 when he died that they permitted those tapes to be shown to others because they didn't have anything else to show after he was killed.
I think every Black and or white church in this city should have a Black history room or something to tell the stories, to show. And I begin with Black ministers. I begin with them. Set aside a place. If you don't have one, build a place.
Give them a room.
Give them a room.
And send Miss Renee to speak.
Who are those women who are not written in the history books, whose names we need to call? Because we have to remember the extraordinary efforts of women who may or may not have been able to read or write, who may or may not have been able to have a title behind their name, but they are extraordinary women, and absent of them, we are not who we are. Who is that?
Well, I would like to call my grandmother's name.
Sure.
Her name was Cynthia. My name is Cynthia.
Name your namesake.
Cynthia Elizabeth Swaggerty. And I would like for her name to be called out today because she was a woman who had a garden, many acres, and that would plant that garden and was so proud. And we as grandchildren and great-grandchildren would get out there and help with the hoeing and the dropping of the seeds, tomatoes, potatoes, all of the different products. But then when the harvest came, that was the proudest day for my grandmother because she would say, come for the harvest. So I would like her name called out, Cynthia Elizabeth Swaggerty.
My mother, Olga Lash Barnes. She is 103. And she got her master's in library science. That's why I connect so well with Professor Haney, because it was from Columbia, all right? So she had the credentials, but she chose to stay home with all of us until I was in the 7th grade. The reason that it sticks with me in terms of the education piece is that when she went back into the school systems in Washington, D.C. as a librarian, my mother believed in labor rights and voting rights, but she crossed the picket line for the public school teachers who were really involved in getting better pay, and she believed in that. But she crossed the picket lines of her own organization in order to open her library to the children in the school, because she said children should not suffer educationally because adults could not get the kind of wages that they were entitled to.
Her name was Ethel Lois Payne. She was the second black female to be certified as a White House correspondent.
Wow.
She was assigned to the White House in 1952. Wow. She became that correspondent at the White House because she went to Japan right after the Second World War, and she wrote articles and sent them back for the Chicago Defender on how the troops were being treated in the war. And then she went on to Korea, and someone came over and read her journals and said, "You're a journalist." She had finished Northwestern University too, but she was a really good writer. But she taught us how to stand up for our rights and how to protest and how to use the power of the pen.
I want to document an experience that was not my own in North Carolina. My grandmother, my maternal grandmother, and her husband held a very prestigious position in that community.
Right.
That's not what's important, though. Because of their ability to border cross between the African American community and the white community, they were seen as people that needed to be talked to. So governors would come in and all that. But the most important thing I remember is that there was a woman who came to my grandmother at one of the stores, and she said, "I need to speak with you right away." She said, "I need to speak to you, Mrs. Lash, right away." She was African American. My grandmother answered the call. They took her to a back room. She said, "I've been serving in a house, and I overheard a conversation from Klansmen, and they're going to come to my house, and they're going to lynch my sons tonight. And I don't know what to do or where to go. And so I came to you." And my grandmother said, "Do not go home tonight." The sons were twins. They had been falsely accused of rape. She said, "Bring your sons to my home." And she said, "But Mrs. Lash, they have to appear at court tomorrow morning to face their accuser." My grandmother told her, "Don't worry about that. I'll handle it. You do not go home." Sure enough, that night the Klan showed up at their home. There was no one there. The next morning, my grandmother escorted the two young men dressed alike to the courthouse. The accuser pointed out the wrong twin, and they were acquitted.
Wow.
My grandmother and grandfather could have lost everything because of the action that she took.
So as we close this out, we have to inspire the next generation to understand the shoulders we stand on. We cannot let them fail. We have to require excellence to them. What is that most important thing that they need to know so that we can continue this legacy that was started many generations before us?
And I can think of my first experience probably was after I graduated from college. And so when I look back, that was in '79, that the disconnect from the 70s now until now, and that the young people, they don't know these stories.
Exactly.
They don't know about the blood that was shed. They don't know about the marches and so forth. So I said, there's big work to do.
There is.
We as responsible citizens in our community, we have a responsibility to make sure that those that walk behind us and walk beside us, and those young people that are coming forth, that we educate them and we tell these stories about what happened. Because they don't know the importance and that this right that we all have was caused by someone sacrificing.
Absolutely.
Right.
And the sacrifice stories are the ones that we need to get out to the people and to the young people.
I grew up believing that voting was very much an integral part of the community life and of our social life and all the things that we did, that through the power of our vote, we could get things accomplished in our neighborhood.
I think that we need to invite cross-generational dialogues where we bring in youth and we say to them, as I think it was Ms. Finch who suggested, we tell the stories. We tell the stories that they didn't hear, but we also charge them, not just to listen, but to become what we know they can become. and not what others tell them they are.
East Tennessee Voices, African American Women and Political History was made possible through the financial support of the East Tennessee Foundation and through a partnership with Chick History, the Beck Cultural Exchange Center, and by viewers like you. Thank you.